And what if I told you that you have access to a more accurate New Testament than Augustine did? Some people prefer to call him Augustine. Aquinas did, and Luther did. Let this sink in. The most precise reconstruction of the New Testament text in history is not sitting in a medieval monastery. No, it's not locked in the Vatican. No, it's not hidden in some secret archive. No, it's on your phone. And that changes the way you think about faith, right? About history and even our place in the history of the church. Yeah, the church didn't always have what we have. In the last episodes, we saw that the New Testament survived through an explosion of manuscripts and early papyri and patristic quotations, textual diversity, not through a single perfect copy floating down from heaven. I think you remember that. Now, here's the part that almost nobody talks about. For most of church history, no one had access to all the evidence, okay? When Augustine of Hippo preached in North Africa, he worked with the manuscripts available in his region. When Jerome translated the Latin Vulgate, he used the Greek copies he could access in the late 4th century. When Thomas Aquinas wrote his Summa, he relied on the medieval textual tradition handed to him. And when Martin Luther translated the New Testament into German, well, he used the printed Greek text available in his day. But here's the reality. They were working with a fraction of the manuscripts we now possess. Today, we have access to thousands of Greek manuscripts. We have early papyri from Egypt, we have uncials, we have minuscules, we have lectionaries, we have ancient translations in Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian. We have quotations embedded in centuries of sermons and debates and theological works, and most importantly, we have them side by side. Think about how you study today. If you are researching something, you don't rely on one blog post, right? You open 15 tabs. You compare sources, you check dates, you look at footnotes, you cross-reference, you read lots and lots and lots of books. Now imagine trying to reconstruct a text without the ability to compare widely separated witnesses. That's what the early church had to do. They preserved the text faithfully, but they didn't have global visibility. Manuscripts traveled slowly. Communication was regional. If I scribe in Alexandria copied the text one way and I scribed in Antioch copied slightly differently, those traditions developed in parallel for centuries. You see, it was not corruption, it was geography. Before the printing press, there was no way to gather everything into one critical comparison. The explosion of accessibility only happens after print culture, and even more dramatically after modern scholarship begins collecting, cataloging, comparing manuscripts systematically. In other words, for 1400 years of church history, no one could see the whole puzzle. Now we can, and that alone changes the conversation. That is why modern textual criticism is a gift of time, not a threat to faith. Some people hear modern textual criticism and immediately think, uh-oh, skeptical, academic deconstruction mode activated. No. Let's slow down. Textual criticism is not about attacking the Bible. It's about comparing manuscripts to determine as best as possible what the original wording was. That's it. It's not even theology. It's not ideology. It's just comparison. And here's the irony. The reason we can reconstruct the New Testament more accurately today is not because modern scholars are smarter than the early church. It's because we have more time behind us. History has delivered more evidence into our hands. In the late 19th century, scholars began to access ancient manuscripts that had been sitting in monasteries and libraries for centuries. Codices that were older than the medieval copies used in early printed edition suddenly entered the conversation. Manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus pushed our access to the New Testament text back into the 4th century, far earlier than what most European scholars had been using for generations. Then, in the 20th century, discoveries of early papyri in Egypt moved the timeline even closer to the first centuries of Christianity. Fragments that were copied early began to confirm readings that scholars had suspected, but couldn't previously verify. And here's the key idea. When you have more witnesses, especially earlier witnesses, you can detect scribal tendencies more clearly. You start to see patterns. You notice that scribes sometimes harmonize passages to make them smoother. Sometimes they clarified ambiguous phrases, and occasionally they expand wording for liturgical use. And once you recognize those tendencies across hundreds of manuscripts, you can reverse engineer the likely earlier form. It's like digital photo restoration. If you have one blurry image, you are guessing. If you have 20 slightly different copies of the same image, well, you can overlay them and remove distortions. Modern textual criticism is essentially overlaying thousands of witnesses to see through centuries of copying. And here's the part that should encourage us. This process has not destabilized the New Testament. No, it has strengthened our confidence in the New Testament. Because the more manuscripts we compare, the clearer the textual history becomes. Variants don't multiply chaos. They expose scribal habits. They reveal how transmission worked. They give us transparency instead of mystery. The passage of time didn't weaken the text. It gave us the tools to see the text more clearly than ever before. And that's not a threat to faith. That's a gift. That makes us see that we are living in the most textually informed era of church history. And here, I think we should let this land personally. You are not reading the New Testament in a fragile, uncertain state, okay? You are reading the New Testament in the most documented, cross-checked, globally analyzed form it has ever had before 1500s. That's a historical fact. When Desiderius Erasmus, for instance, produced the first printed Greek New Testament in 1516, he worked quickly and with limited manuscripts, some of them quite late. It was revolutionary for its time, of course, but it wasn't based on thousands of witnesses. It was based on a handful of copies. Today, scholars work with thousands of Greek manuscripts, early papyri, ancient translations, patristic citations, and digitally cataloged, photographed, and compared across continents. If a manuscript is housed in Rome, it can be examined by a scholar in Dallas. If a fragment sits in Oxford, it can be analyzed by someone here in Vancouver. High-resolution images, global databases, collaborative projects. This is not medieval isolation, you see. This is global transparency. And that means something profound for you as a reader of the New Testament. You are not dependent on one manuscript tradition. You are not locked into one regional stream. You are not trusting blindly. You are standing at the end of 2,000 years of preservation and at least 500 years of global comparison. And here's what's very beautiful. The core text has remained astonishingly stable. Despite geographical spread, despite hand copying, despite centuries without printing, what we see today is not a text reconstructed from chaos. It is a text clarified through abundance. Think about that. In your lifetime, you've seen technology transform everything, right? Communication, medicine, transportation. But one of the quiet revolutions of the modern era is textual access. We live in a time when the ancient world is more visible than it has ever been. And instead of destabilizing Scripture, deeper access has reinforced its integrity. And that should inspire confidence, not arrogance, not superiority, but gratitude. Why? Because you and I live in a moment where faith and scholarship are not enemies. They are partners. That's right. And that means something for creators, for teachers, for pastors, for readers of the Bible. We don't need to exaggerate uncertainty to sound intelligent. We don't need to ignore textual history to protect faith. We can speak honestly and boldly because we are standing on the most textually informed foundation the church has ever had. That's not accidental. That's providential. Okay, so here's the headline. For the first time in church history, we can compare virtually every surviving New Testament manuscript tradition side by side. We can weigh earlier witnesses. We can identify scribal habits. We can trace textual streams across centuries. And what's the result? Not collapse, clarity. You are not holding a text that survived by accident. You are holding a text that survived exposure. It went through copying. It went through a geographic spread. It went through scholarly scrutiny. It went through global comparison. And it's still here, more transparent than ever. But now comes the twist, okay? And this is where things get really important. Just because we can reconstruct the text more accurately today does not mean the early church had the same list of books we do, okay? Text history and canon history are not the same conversation. You can have a very stable text of a book and still have debates about whether that book belongs in the collection. And almost nobody in church culture keeps those two discussions separate. And that confusion has created massive misunderstanding in documentaries, YouTube channels, and even pulpits. So next episode, we are going to untangle one of the biggest mistakes in modern Bible conversations. Why canon history and text history are two completely different fields, and why mixing them up distorts both. Because understanding that distinction doesn't weaken your confidence. Actually, it sharpens it. I'll see you in episode 9.